The Supreme Court chamber fell into stunned silence as Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward in his chair, a rare smile playing across his normally impassive face. The oral arguments in Williams v. Texas Election Commission had been proceeding along expected lines until Representative Jasmine Crockett, making her debut appearance before the High Court, cited a series of voting rights precedents that directly contradicted the conservative justice's apparent direction. As the freshman congresswoman from Texas completed her analysis of historical barriers to ballot access, Thomas broke his characteristic silence with an audible chuckle that immediately captured the attention of everyone in the courtroom. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the chamber, "I find it amusing when politicians who've been in Washington for barely a year lecture this court about the Constitution they just swore to uphold. Perhaps before instructing us on precedent, you might consider gaining some experience beyond a few months in the House and a brief stint in a state legislature." The dismissive tone, unusual for the typically reserved Thomas, created immediate tension as he continued, "After all, several members of this court have been interpreting the Constitution since before you entered law school. Your enthusiasm is commendable, but there's a certain presumption in a junior representative explaining constitutional law to justices with decades of experience." The unexpected personal jab from the court's most senior member, clearly designed to diminish Crockett's credibility through reference to her relative inexperience, created palpable discomfort throughout the chamber. Chief Justice Roberts appeared momentarily startled by his colleague's departure from decorum, while several associate justices shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The gallery remained completely silent, aware they were witnessing an extraordinary breach of the court's typical formality. For a moment, it seemed the cutting remark might achieve its apparent purpose of rattling the first-term congresswoman appearing before the nation's highest court. Instead, observers witnessed a remarkable transformation as Crockett straightened her posture, her expression shifting from momentary surprise to composed resolve. "Justice Thomas," she responded, her voice steady and clear, "you're absolutely right about your decades of experience on this court, which is why I find it necessary to remind you of your own words without consulting notes." She continued, "In Holder v. Hall 1994, you wrote that the Voting Rights Act should be limited to addressing only direct barriers to ballot access, not broader systemic obstacles. Yet in your own memoir, My Grandfather's Son, you described how your grandfather was prevented from voting despite no formal legal barrier, because the registration office arbitrarily closed whenever black citizens attempted to register. As murmurs spread through the courtroom at this unexpected counterpoint, Crockett continued with unwavering precision, "Your personal history perfectly illustrates why this court's previous recognition of both direct and indirect voting barriers has been essential to fulfilling the Constitution's promise. Your family's experience demonstrates exactly why the narrow interpretation you're advocating now would fail to protect the very rights your grandfather was denied." Then, with perfect timing, that completely shifted the exchange's dynamic, she added, "So while I respect your decades on the bench, Justice Thomas, perhaps I might suggest that your own lived experience, which you've eloquently documented, actually supports the broader precedents I've cited, rather than the cramped reading being proposed today. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps us reconnect with fundamental principles we ourselves have previously recognized." As the chamber reacted to this extraordinary response, using Thomas's own personal history and writings to directly counter his dismissive remark, while maintaining absolute professionalism, Crockett concluded with quiet dignity, "The Constitution's age doesn't make it less relevant to new challenges, just as my relative youth doesn't make the precedents I've cited any less binding. I'm confident this court will ultimately focus on the legal principles at stake, rather than the personal characteristics of those presenting them." What followed was something almost unprecedented in Supreme Court proceedings, in a moment of absolute silence, as even Thomas appeared momentarily at a loss for words, his earlier dismissive expression replaced by what observers described as stunned reassessment at having his own personal history and writings used so effectively to counter his attempt at diminishment. The Chief Justice, recognizing the extraordinary tension, quickly steered the arguments back to technical legal questions, But the exchange had created what court watchers would later describe as one of the most dramatic moments of speaking truth to power ever witnessed in the Supreme Court, made all the more effective by its respectful but unflinching directness. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation that has everyone talking, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analysis of the most revealing moments in our nation's highest court that mainstream media often glosses over. Now let's get back to the remarkable exchange where Representative Jasmine Crockett responded to Justice Thomas's dismissive comments by calmly citing his own memoir and personal history to make a compelling constitutional argument that left the entire Supreme Court chamber in stunned silence. Jasmine Crockett's path to that pivotal moment before the Supreme Court reflected an unconventional trajectory in American politics. Elected to Congress in 2022 after serving just one term in the Texas state legislature, the 41-year-old former civil rights attorney had quickly established herself as one of the most knowledgeable voices on voting rights despite her junior status. Prior to entering politics, she had built a reputation representing clients in complex voting rights cases throughout Texas, giving her unusual fluency with both the technical legal frameworks and the practical impacts of ballot access restrictions. Though relatively new to Washington, she approached constitutional questions with the same meticulous preparation that had characterized her legal career, where thorough knowledge of both case law and personal narratives often proved decisive in courtroom settings. Justice Clarence Thomas, by contrast, had followed a more traditional path to judicial prominence. Appointed to the Supreme Court in 1991, he had established himself as one of the court's most consistent conservative voices over his 3 decades on the bench. Throughout his tenure, he developed a distinctive judicial philosophy, emphasizing original text and narrow readings of constitutional protections, particularly regarding voting rights, where he frequently advocated limiting federal oversight of state election procedures. His personal story, rising from poverty in Pinpoint, Georgia, to the nation's highest court, formed a central element of his public identity, documented extensively in his 2007 memoir, My Grandfather's Son, where he described his family's experiences with racism and disenfranchisement, despite his generally skeptical approach to expansive interpretations of civil rights protections. The case that brought them into this extraordinary confrontation, Williams versus Texas Election Commission, centered on new restrictions on ballot access that voting rights advocates claimed disproportionately impacted minority communities through ostensibly neutral requirements. As a member of Congress with direct experience litigating similar issues in Texas, Crockett had been invited to present arguments supporting the challenge, an unusual but not unprecedented role for a sitting representative with specific legal expertise relevant to a constitutional question. For the first 30 minutes of oral arguments, the exchanges followed predictable patterns, with conservative justices questioning whether the challenged provisions actually violated constitutional protections, and liberal justices exploring the practical impacts on different voting populations. The dynamic shifted dramatically, however, when Crockett began systematically connecting modern ballot restrictions to historical disenfranchisement methods previously recognized as unconstitutional despite their ostensibly neutral language. The court's precedents from Anderson through Pernovich have consistently recognized that seemingly neutral regulations must be evaluated in their practical operation and historical context, she explained with remarkable command of the case law. When we examine these provisions against the backdrop of Texas's documented history of adapting voting restrictions to maintain disparate impacts after previous methods are struck down, the constitutional infirmity becomes clear. Despite the facially neutral language, it was this methodical deconstruction directly challenging the conservative justice's inclination toward a narrower reading that seemed to prompt Thomas's uncharacteristic intervention. Known for rarely speaking during oral arguments throughout much of his tenure, his decision to break his typical reserve with a personal jab rather than a substantive question created an immediate sense that something extraordinary was unfolding in the usually formal proceedings. The gallery remained completely silent, aware they were witnessing something historic. Yet what came next, Crockett's poised, precise, and devastatingly factual rebuttal, transformed a moment of condescension into one of the most powerful constitutional exchanges in recent memory. Her respectful, evidence-based response not only reaffirmed the strength of her argument, but demonstrated that expertise, preparation, and composure can cut through even the most entrenched hierarchies of authority. Clips of the encounter quickly spread across social media, with millions praising Crockett's calm dismantling of dismissive rhetoric and her ability to turn an attempted insult into a teaching moment about constitutional integrity and lived experience. This moment reveals something profound about effective advocacy. One constitutional law professor remarked, "When faced with attempted diminishment, she didn't defend her credentials or respond with attack. She redirected focus to substance and truth." The exchange has since become a landmark example of how deep preparation, respect, and intellectual agility can transform even the most intimidating setting into a platform for principled dialogue. For Representative Crockett, that day solidified her reputation as a fearless, disciplined constitutional voice, proving that the power of substance can silence even the most dismissive opposition. If you found this breakdown of one of the most remarkable exchanges in recent Supreme Court history informative, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analysis of pivotal moments that reveal deeper patterns in our constitutional conversations. And leave a comment below with your thoughts on effective responses to dismissive treatment in professional settings and how thorough preparation can transform attempted diminishment into opportunities for substantive dialogue.